Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Genesis here. Today we're going to have a look at ThieAudio Hype2. So as you know, recently ThieAudio has returned for the third round of Monarch with the ThieAudio Monarch MkIII. And the most important feature of that IM is the new bass design with dual dynamic drivers. This is something they call the impact square design. So in Hype2, we have exactly the same bass woofer. So let's take a look. The Hype2 comes in the same large box that you have when you buy the Monarch MkIII or the V16. So when I pick up this box from the post office, I was surprised by how large it is. The content of the package is also nearly identical. So the case, the same large semi-hard carrying case, 2 types of ear tips including the silicone tips and 3 pairs of foam tips, which I believe to be something from TRN. The only difference is that the Hype2 comes with a single-ended cable rather than the cable with interchangeable plugs like the Monarch MkIII and the V16. So in this review, if this is not a stock cable, this is an aftermarket cable from NiceHack that I use because I want to use the 4.4 balance connector. About the earpiece themselves, the construction quality of the earpiece are very high. It strongly reminds me of the Monarch MkIII and what's that thing called? Elysian Acoustic Gaia. I couldn't find the seam line with my fingernails. Everything is well polished, and I think the faceplate of the Hype2 is also one of the custom faceplate options for the Monarch MkIII. So this IM is molded carefully to the shape of your ears, so it is easier to fit in the concha area of your ears. The only problem I can think of is the nozzle. As you can see, it is thick but short, so the choice of ear tips would be a little bit tricky because you want to get this earphone to be a little bit deeper inside your ears to protect the treble extension, to ensure that you have on the treble extension. So you want to go a little bit deeper, and because of this nozzle design, you need to choose the ear tips more carefully. I found that the stock ear tips from ThieAudio works pretty well, both the foam tips and the silicone tips. Of course, if you use the foam tips, you will lose a bit of upper treble extension. The sound would be a little bit mellower, but the soundstage would feel smaller and less precise. If you use silicone tips, then I recommend to stick to something that is not very long because you don't want to extend the nozzle further and push the IMs out of your ears. Now let's talk about the sound. The overall tonality of the Hype2 can be described as a very strong U-shape. So that means you can have clean bass boost, you have very neutral mid-range, and then you have boost in the treble. And it's not just the upper treble, but the treble boost also go a little bit closer into around the 8 and 5 kHz region. So let's talk about the mid-range. The mid-range of Hype2 can be described as flat. So it is flat on the way from around 250 Hz to roughly around 800 Hz before it starts rising for the ear gain compensation. So that flat tuning ensures that this IM does not contribute additional warmth or thickness on vocals and instruments. At the same time, Hype2 doesn't have the dip around 250 Hz to artificially thinning the mid-range to increase the perception of clarity. So if you dislike that kind of tuning, it doesn't happen here. The upper mid-range of Hype2 has a proper ear gain boost. It starts from around 800 Hz rather than 1 kHz, and it goes to peaking around 3 kHz. The amount of boosting is more conservative than what you would expect from a Harman 29M like Moondrop variation. So with variation, you're going to have 12 dB variation from the low mid-range to upper mid-range. With the Hype2, it is 7 dB. So it means that when you actually listen to the music, you don't feel the mid-range to be thin and shouty like you would expect from a harmony tune. The mid-range feels a little bit denser and warmer, not because there's more power in the lower mid-range, but because there's less contrast between upper and lower mid-range. And if we talk about comparison, I will say the tuning of the mid-range of Hype2 is nearly identical to the Monarch MkIII. Now let's talk about the treble. The treble of Hype2 gently rolls off after around 4 kHz, but it doesn't go off the cliff immediately, so there's still pretty strong presence around 5K and 8K before it rolling off, and then it returns strongly around 15-16K, similarly to 64-audio IMs. So what that means is, when you listen to a rock band, for example, cymbals and hi-hats, it wouldn't jump out from the mix like usual when you listen to IMs with boosted treble. Those instruments would be a little bit behind the vocal, so you need to look for it. But on the plus side, this kind of arrangement would make cymbals and hi-hats more easy to listen to. And Hype2 actually can resolve the details of those instruments pretty well. Hype2 also doesn't hide or intensify the sibilants, so if you listen to music with a lot of sibilants, it would come through. But this IM doesn't introduce additional harshness and sibilants to your music. The upper treble region, around 15-16 kHz of Hype2, is more emphasized than what you would expect when you listen to a normal Harman Tunes IM, like a variation. So that means, for example, when you listen to a violin recording in a concert hall with the reverberation around the recording hall, you would hear that reverb more strongly with Hype2 comparing to variation. Now let's talk about the bass and dynamic. So both the sub bass and the mid bass of Hype2 is boosted. So that means you will feel the bass, but you also hear the bass, it is different from something like let's say Sinfonium Helios, when you feel the bass, but sometimes you don't really hear the bass because they cut the mid bass. With this IM, you hear it and you feel it. Despite the strong bass, I feel the bass is natural. So this strong bass presentation ensures that cello, bass have proper body and power. But at the same time, when you listen to, let's say, a cello concerto with a lot of energy in the lower end, the presentation doesn't feel muddy or dense. So the bass attack is well defined, and at the peak of the attack, you can feel the clear impact of the bass hitting. At the same time, the bass properly decay, and there's also very strong sense of texture and details. So for example, when you listen to bass guitar with this IM, you can hear the bass guitar, you can hear the texture boom sound rather than just the sound of the bass, and you can also hear the notes. So I find myself listening more carefully to the bass part of the recording whenever I listen to music using the Hype2. Hype2 is also very competent in conveying the sense of rhythm. For example, when you listen to soundtrack with a marching rhythm, you can feel the sense of beat, the sense of pulsing going in the music. Regarding the resolution, the strength of Hype2 is in terms of the clarity and separation. So for example, when listened to a track by Pentatonix, it is very easy to follow individual voice. Even when the music gets more busy, this IM can still separate and then let me follow individual components of the mix. The weakness of Hype2 is in terms of the micro details, the texture and nuance of the mid-range. I wouldn't say it is bad, but it is not as good as the overall sense of separation and clarity. For example, when listening to a detail-rich violin solo with the Hype2, I find myself constantly turning up the volume a little bit more, because I want to find more of the texture and details in the mid-range, and I want to hear more details of the sound bouncing off the concert hall. But it just gets louder, but it doesn't give me more of that. So I guess this is a limitation of the driver topology at this point. Now let's talk about the soundstage. The positioning of the foreground, that means main singer, main instrument, the louder part of the music, is, I would say, Hype to place those foreground elements as a decent distance. So it always feels somewhere in front of the eyes, or maybe slightly behind your eyes, rather than going on the way, like recess on the way further away, or push on the way deep in your skull. So Hype 2 provide very stable positioning. So that means it's easy to point out where each part of the mix is. For example, the voice here, the guitars here, the backup vocals are around here. This IM can place the instruments and vocal both left to right, front to back, and also low to high. So there's this, a sense of 3Dness to the presentation of the foreground of the soundstage. The main limitations or drawback of the soundstage presentation of Hype 2 is in terms of the background. That means the more quiet element. For example, when you listen to a live recording, the cheer of the audience from the background. So with Hype 2, the cheers doesn't feel very separate from the foreground. It doesn't feel like being pushed to the background. In conclusion, I think Hype 2 is a very competent and versatile IM because it has a neutral, uncolored mid-range, but at the same time it doesn't feel very shrill or very thin, so it is usable across different scenarios and library. The bass is excellent regardless how I look at it, in terms of the bass attack, bass impact, sub-bass, texture, details. Everything about the bass is consistently excellent. The technical performance is also decent, likely thanks to the boost in the upper treble region. Yes, I wish that the background of the Hype 2 is more pushed away to create that sense of holographic soundstage. And I do wish that the mid-range has a little bit more texture and details. But at no point this IM fallen below the level that I consider to be technically competent. So, should you get Hype 2? It depends on your taste of tonality. If you listen to Monarch 2 and you think to yourself, this is how an IM should be tuned, this is perfect tuning, then Hype 2 is a good option. If you want something like Monarch 2 but with better bass that you can take around with you, and you don't want to buy the Monarch 3 immediately. But if you listen to Monarch 2 and you find that IM is so boring, like watching paint drying, then this IM wouldn't change your opinion. But it's fine, there's plenty of options out there. So that's all for today about the Hype 2. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.